righteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And we noted the phrase last week, the particular phrase, the wrath of God is revealed. Is revealed. Paul speaks of that as being a present and ongoing occurrence. That wherever there is unrighteousness, wherever there is ungodliness, there is the manifestation of God's wrath. Now, there seemed to be a little bit of confusion last week with regard to the application of that, and I want to make sure that we're clear on that. On the top of the next page, we talked about how God's wrath might be revealed against ungodliness and unrighteousness. For example, infidelity, that is atheism, unbelief, because that is the charge that Paul levels against the Gentiles, that they have suppressed the truth of the existence of God. Moreover, they have suppressed the truth that is inherent in all men. In other words, things that can be known to be right or wrong without any type of written revelation, things that are known and understood by all men everywhere. And so, as we closed last week, we were talking about how God's wrath is revealed. And I mentioned in particular things like abortion and crime and those types of things. And if you looked at the lesson, the very last line before that question is that unfortunately the manifestation of God's wrath is also often felt by the innocent. So when we say that the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, we don't mean that it's necessarily revealed in the people who commit it. It's just revealed in general in those types of situations. And it can manifest itself in any number of ways. And I mentioned specifically, for example, the God-given role of government in Romans 13 is to protect its citizens and punish evildoers. I mean, that's Romans 13. The specifics of God-given government and its God-given role is to protect the citizens that are under its purview and punish evildoers. Now, when a nation decides that they don't want to protect their citizens and they don't want to protect evil or punish evildoers, then innocent people suffer. And so the innocent become the participants in the wrath of God. You know, in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11, the Bible says, "Because sentence is not executed speedily against evildoers, the hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil." In layman's terms, when you don't punish people severely for wrongdoing, people will not give a second thought to doing wrong. And that's the world that we live in. And it's getting worse. When governments, when people are arrested for assault or murder or any rape or any type of violent crime, and you turn that person loose on the public before the sun goes down, you just release them back into the general populace, or you let them plead down to some minor offense, and then turn them loose again. What do people think is going to happen? Our government has abdicated its role in protecting its citizens and punishing evildoers. Look, 5 million people have illegally entered this country since Joe Biden became president. 5 million. That's the population of the whole state of Alabama in the last 19 or so months. What do people think's going to happen when you let millions of people come in, undocumented, unchecked, and just basically bum rush into the nation? Do we not expect bad things are going to happen? Do innocent people suffer when those types of things happen? When you got 100,000 people dead from fentanyl overdoses, when that fentanyl came across the border, when you got people that can't find work because people that are here illegally are working for cash for half the amount of money that somebody else might work for. Can you imagine trying to run a roofing business and doing it the right way in today's time? Or a construction business? It's nigh unto impossible. What happens? People suffer. That's the wrath of God. When the government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, innocent people suffer. That's the wrath of God revealed against unrighteousness. You let people burn cities down to the ground for 8 months solid and kill dozens of people, and the people that are at the highest levels of government are taking up GoFundMe accounts to bail them out of jail. Bad things are going to happen. So the wrath of God is revealed against unrighteousness in all shapes and forms, whether it be by individuals, entities, governments, etc. That we see the result of the wrath. That we see the result of the wrath of God. Now, on the opposite side, if the government was doing its job to punish evildoers and protect its citizens, good things are going to happen, right? Not that nothing bad will ever happen, but as a general rule, good things happen. And so this is just a manifestation of the natural laws that God has put in place in this world. When governments and people try to do good, as a general rule, good things will happen. Peace will be the order of the day. When people don't want to think about God, when the people who live in a country don't want to follow God, and the government doesn't want to uphold its God-given responsibilities, its ordained duties, bad things are going to happen, and innocent people suffer, and that's the wrath of God revealed against all unrighteousness. And so I want us to be perfectly clear that I'm not talking about that God's wrath is always revealed against the individual or the person or the entity that does unrighteousness, but that the results of those actions will reveal themselves in bad things happening. Was talking to somebody this morning, and one of the things that was said, he goes, all of this started when we made it legal to kill babies. When you look, Mother Teresa got it right. If you don't have any problem killing the unborn, there is nothing that you will not do. If you can kill an unborn baby and pillow your head at night, and not only that, but advocate it as something that's good and right, or as Hillary Clinton said, moral. It's moral to kill babies. Then there's not anything beyond the scope of reality. And we've killed about 65 million of them since 1973. 65 million. That's just the United States. Do you want to know why? Do you want to know why people fear the government of China? They had forced abortion for decades. They had a one-child policy. If you had one child and you were pregnant with another child, the government would come and snatch you out of your house and carry you down to the clinic and force you to have an abortion. So do you think it's any wonder that they don't mind running over their people with tanks when they get out in the streets? That's the wrath of God revealed against all unrighteousness. When you abandon God, bad things happen. Now, there are some senses, and I won't get to them probably won't even get to them this week, probably until we get to about verse 27. There are specific instances where the wrath of God is revealed against unrighteousness in the individual practicing the unrighteousness. And Paul specifies that, beginning in about verse 27, but I don't want to get too far ahead in that discussion. But I want us to be clear about what it means that God's wrath is revealed against all unrighteousness. And the last thing I said about this, that it shows us that God's wrath is not fickle or capricious. In other words, God just doesn't decide one day, I'm going to let 4 people get away with this, but the 5th one's had it. In other words, God is non-discriminatory in His wrath revealed against all unrighteousness. It doesn't matter if Jewish people do it or if Gentile people do it. And by the way, Jews and Gentiles are the ones under discussion here. Actually, Gentiles are under discussion in Romans 1, and eventually we'll get to Romans 2 that Jews will be under discussion in Romans 2, and then Paul's going to pile them all together in Romans chapter 3. All right, that's the discussion of the first 3 chapters of the book of Romans. But it shows us that God's wrath is holy and it's personal. In other words, He does not discriminate in the revealing of His wrath against all unrighteousness. In other words, He doesn't say, all right, well, this group is doing this, but nothing bad's going to happen. But this group is doing the exact same thing, but I'm going to punish them. It doesn't work that way. God's natural law does not work that way. But now I want to look at question 8. And that comes from verse 19. It says, because what may be what? Known of God is manifest or revealed in them, for God has shown it to them. Now I want to think about that. Now he's talking about the Gentiles, Greeks and barbarians, so to speak. That's who's under discussion here. The Gentiles, particularly the upper crust Gentiles and the barbarians. Now note what it says. What may be known of God is revealed or manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. Now note the first note there under question 8. What may be known is more accurately rendered for what is known of God. Not what may be revealed or known of God is revealed. Not what may be known is revealed. What is known is revealed. In other words, it's not like God set the pieces of the puzzle out there and allowed you to know it by revealing it to you by putting the pieces of the puzzle together. That's what you might think of what may be known. That's not what the text is teaching. It's teaching what is known. The Gentiles didn't have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. God had already shown it to them. He'd shown Himself to the Gentiles. He'd shown Himself to the Gentiles, particularly from the days of the patriarchy. He'd shown Himself to the Gentiles, even after the giving of the law. You know, a lot of people have this idea that once God gave Israel the law of Moses, and they became His people, that God just chucked the Gentiles and tossed them to the wind until Pentecost. That's not true. God still dealt with the Gentiles in the same way that He'd always been dealing with them. You know, why, if God didn't care about the Gentiles, why did He keep sending prophets up there to preach to them? You know, why did He send Jonah to Nineveh if God had just pitched the Gentiles to the wind? Because I got my people now, and the rest of them can just go pound sand. No. God still loved the Gentiles. God still wanted the Gentiles to do right. And by the way, almost the entirety of the book of Amos is prophecies against Gentile nations. Now, why would God send a prophet? By the way, Amos is probably 8 centuries before Christ. I think Amos is probably one of the earliest prophets. Maybe 9 centuries before Christ. Why was God sending prophets to the Gentile nations?
He told Abraham that all nations would be blessed.
Through Christ. But how do the Gentiles figure into that? You know, we talked in I guess it was Sunday night. We talked about how the Gentiles could still be saved, even though they weren't answerable to the law of Moses. And they had to continue in the covenant that they had in order to be saved by Christ. By the way, all the Jews that died under the old law were still saved by Jesus. They weren't saved by the law of Moses, they were saved by Jesus. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15 says that Jesus died for the transgressions that were committed by those under the old covenant. So the blood of Jesus flowed backwards from the cross to cleanse the sins of those who died in a faithful relationship under the law of Moses. Then it's also just as valid to say that any righteous Gentiles were also saved by the blood of Jesus. It flowed backwards for them. People like Cornelius, who obviously lived prior to Cornelius. And so, but we want to understand that God always cared about the Gentiles. He loved those people just like He loved Israel. He wanted them to be saved. And so He sent men to preach to the Gentiles, reveal Himself to the Gentiles. And then on top of all that, all of the prophetic or the work of the prophets with regard to the Gentiles, there's still the fact that God has revealed Himself to every person in that we all understand what's right and wrong. Whether or not you've ever picked up a Bible, people know what's right and wrong. I mean, this idea that it kills me. These people that still want to hold on to the Ten Commandments act like they say, "Oh, if you don't believe in the Ten Commandments, you think it's okay to commit adultery. Oh, if you don't believe in the Ten Commandments, you think it's all right to covet. Oh, you think it's all right to murder." No. What you think is that those things weren't wrong before the Ten Commandments came around. But men had been living for 2,000 years before the Ten Commandments rolled around. Was it not wrong to commit adultery before the Ten Commandments came around? Was it not wrong to covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's possessions before the Ten Commandments came around? Was it not wrong to commit murder before the Ten Commandments came around? So how did those people know that? Well, in the days of the patriarchy, God revealed it to them. But even when they suppressed it, they still knew it was wrong. People know those things are wrong. People know that stealing is wrong. You don't have to have the Ten Commandments or the gospel of Christ to know that stealing is wrong. It's wrong everywhere, under all kinds of systems. And so what Paul is saying, I think in two senses. First of all, God revealed Himself to the Gentiles in the system of patriarchy. But He also revealed Himself to the Gentiles in what is known as general revelation. In other words, what can be known without being written down. And the idea that God exists, and the idea that God has a standard of morality which has been infused into every single human being, can be known without any religious handbook. Those things can be known. And so that's what Paul's saying. Not what may be known, what they knew. Because God showed it to them. If He showed it to them, it's not may be known. If He showed it to them, it's what's known. It's what's known. And so what Paul says here is that well, I want to show you one thing here. Read something to you. Well, go to the next paragraph. Under this says, the Gentile world had not been left in the lurch after God separated Israel to Himself and giving them the law. The Lord still walked among the Gentiles, loved the Gentiles, sent His prophets to the Gentiles, necessarily implying that they were in violation of God's law, and then He punished them for their impiety toward God and their contempt for their fellow man. And I made the note here, Jonah to Nineveh and Amos 1 and 2 is 6 Gentile nations. But I want to think about the last part of verse 18. It says, they suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. In other words, they know what's true, but they beat it down. In other words, for example, How do Christians fall away? Do they fall away all at once, or do they fall away a little bit at a time? When people start, do people just quit attending services all at once, or do they quit a little along the way? Well, we know how that happens, right? And what happens? They miss a time or two, and their conscience bothers them, but then conscience doesn't bother them as much. So pretty soon they're out on Sunday night forever, and then they start missing on Wednesday night, and then pretty soon they're out on Wednesday night, little by little, and they're the part of the Sunday morning only crowd. And then what happens? They miss 2 or 3 Sundays, or Sunday here, Sunday. What's that?
Then it turns into our fault.
Yeah, then it's our fault. But the point is, little by little, what happens? They beat that conscience down. That conscience that used to bother them about forsaking the assembly doesn't bother them anymore. What have they done? They've beat that conscience down. They've suppressed it. They've seared it with a hot iron. All right? It's like a callus. Well, Paul says that's what the Gentiles did with their knowledge of God. They wanted to pursue unrighteousness to such a degree that they beat down their ideas of God so that their conscience wouldn't bother them anymore. Now, I'm going to read you a quote from a guy by the name of Aldous Huxley. And Huxley was a famous British infidel. All right? And he wrote in a book called Ends and Means. Now, I'm going to read you some quotes from Huxley's Ends and Means. He said, "I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning, and consequently assumed that it had none." In other words, here's what I wanted, so I assumed it was true. "And I was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality." In other words, the world we lived in had a standard of morality, and we did not want to live by that standard. So therefore, we assumed that the world had no meaning, which means if there's no meaning, there's no standard, there's no God. He says, "We objected to morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. The supporters of this system claimed that it embodied the meaning, the Christian meaning, they said, of the world. There was one simple method of confuting these people and justifying ourselves in our erotic revolt. We would deny that the world had any meaning whatsoever." In other words, we wouldn't argue with them about their system of morality. We'd just deny that it existed at all. He said, "I wanted to believe the Darwinian idea. I chose to believe it, not because I think there was enormous evidence for it, nor because it had the full authority to give interpretation to my origins. But I chose to believe it because it delivered me from trying to find meaning and freed me to my own erotic passions." I did not believe in God because the evidence was there for me not to believe in God. I chose not to believe in God because I didn't want to live according to God's moral systems. I mean, at least he's honest. At least he's not out there trying to make an argument that God doesn't exist. He said, "I just choose to believe that he doesn't exist because I want to do what I want to do." And that's why I chose this path. Well, that's exactly what the Gentiles did.
Brother Todd,
Sir.
I'm thinking if a person is a Christian and they went to church about all their life, and then they get away from the church, I know, speaking from experience, on Sunday morning or Wednesday night, they think about church.
Oh, even when they're not there.
Yeah, yeah,
They think about it.
right. They know where they're supposed to be.
Right. They can't get away from it. It's kind of like the old train up a child in the way that he should go. And that's not a truism. I mean, that's a truism, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Yeah, just because they don't go doesn't mean they don't think about it. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. Or I'm sure that, well, I know it's true because there was a time in my young adult life when I didn't go to church like I should. But I knew what was going on at 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, and I knew what was going on at 7 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, even though I wasn't where I'd been all my life at those times. And so I hadn't thought about it, but that's true. All right, so we note that the Gentiles beat down their conscience about God because they wanted to live the way they wanted to live. Now, question number 9 comes from verse 20. It says, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen." Isn't that interesting? His invisible attribute. How do you clearly see something that's invisible?
I think when you look at creation and the complexity in it's fine-tuned, so you understand not only there has to be a God, there has to be a God that has the power and the knowledge to create.
Right, and Kyle used the key phrase, understand. The word, sometimes when we say I see a thing, we mean I understand it. And I think that's the sense in which we're talking about here. They understand, for since the creation of the world, the invisible attributes of God are clearly understood. Being what? Being understood or seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. All right. The word Godhead is not a good rendering. When we talk about the Godhead, we're talking about what? The Trinity. The Trinity. And that's not the word there. The word there entails the word for God, theos. But what's truly being mentioned here is not the idea of the Trinity, but the nature of God. See, His eternal power and I've got a margin note, His divine nature. I believe the word is theotes. Theo, God, taste, essence. In other words, we can determine the essence of God by there are a lot of things that we can know about God without having to have the Bible. And that's what Kyle said. You can look around and you see creation. You just look at this world and you look at the unbelievable detail in all these animals and insects and people and the plant life and how nature works. And you just know it didn't get here by accident. You just know that it didn't get here by accident. Now, that doesn't mean you understand that the God of heaven exists, but you understand that something exists. And we've talked about this on numerous occasions through the years. Many times men devised religious systems that were polytheistic. In other words, there was a God of the moon, and a God of the sun, and a God of the water, and a God of the earth, and a God of the, there was a God for everything. But in almost every account, there's still what? But there's still one God over all those gods. I mean, if you took the Greek gods, of all the gods that the Greeks had, there was still one at the top, right? Who? Zeus. That's right. Zeus was still. They understood, even in their polytheistic society and way of thinking, they understood there's still got to be one, because they understand the hierarchy. They must have read Jordan Peterson's book, Kyle. They understood the hierarchy. So His divine nature can be understood. That his power and the nature of God can be understood. That not only is he powerful, he's logical. He's all-knowing. Just because a person is powerful doesn't mean they know how to exercise that power properly, right? But when you look at the world, you can understand that God is not only he's powerful, but he's unspeakably intelligent. He's unspeakably intelligent. All right, and so all right. Let me look at the notes here. Because I don't want to get to question 10, because I've got another series of quotes I want to read you from a different atheist that will just boggle your mind. All right, but the note under number 9, God's eternal power and divine nature are true. These are the truths known and suppressed by the Gentiles. Again, the word Godhead should be understood in the context of his divine attributes. The word rendered is only here in the New Testament. This is the only time this particular word appears in the New Testament. And the fact that these things are clearly seen, being understood, and here's the fact that God has an eternal nature is this. All things material come into existence and then go away, right? All material things come into existence and then go away. So therefore, we would also have to, of necessity, understand that whatever or whoever made the material things is not material. In other words, what we understand, whatever it was that made the world couldn't be material, because what's material, it goes away. So that's the idea of his eternal power and his divine nature. His divine nature. And so when things that are material come into existence and pass away, then whoever or whatever made these things cannot share these same characteristics. All right? I want to stop right there and pick up at number 10 down to starts in verse 22. Look, we won't spend as much time in a lot of the chapters following as we do in chapter 1, but there's just too much. There's too much. Look, given the world that we live in now and the direction that this world and our society is going, these are things and arguments that we need to be prepared to make. Because our country is increasingly more and more atheistic. And so these are arguments that we need to make. So I'll stop right there, and Lord willing, next week, that'd be the 16th.